What is an agrarian civilization? This is one of the essential concepts in world history and one of our organizing principles frequently. It's important to keep in mind that the term civilization historically has often been used as a way of basically attacking, creating a hierarchy, sort of judging between the lesser and the poor, saying that some societies are better, more civilized than others, which are more savage, more primitive, more uncivilized. In this particular case, what we say when we say civilization is we're talking about a society which meets certain criteria. We're not saying that that's a better society than the others necessarily, and we're not even saying that the people that live in that society are going to be more intelligent or better in any way than people who live in another non-civilized, quote, civilized society. But we are saying that they meet these criteria. And often historians have messed around a little bit with the criteria, but these are some of the most common things that fit into judging whether or not something is an agrarian urban civilization. Okay, first of all, pretty much historically, up until quite recently, if you're talking about civilized cities, if you're talking about cities in general, you're talking about rivers, with very few exceptions. And those exceptions are probably on a coastline. Rivers provide the water for farming, irrigation, which is one of the things that helps farming to become much more productive. And so it's not just a matter of scraping by to keep your own family fed, but you can produce enough of a surplus that you can pay taxes and support others. It's a source of drinking water, which is an essential requirement for life. It's a source of transportation. Now keep in mind, if you want to transport things long distances or even short distances, your options are, historically, you carry it on your back yourself or on your servants' backs. You load it onto a horse or cattle, or you put it into a cart. Any of those options, whatever you're doing, whether you're using your feet or your livestock or some kind of wheeled vehicle, you're going to move slow and it's going to take you a long time to get anywhere. Rivers make a huge difference. You can travel much quicker and you don't have to have the same kind of effort being expended, either on you as an individual or on your livestock, which you won't need. So they're critical for transportation. And they're, of course, also critical for communication. A message can't travel any faster than a good in this time period. If it will either travel by the time it takes your feet, by the time it takes your horse, or alternatively, by the time it takes you to travel along the river. So rivers are essential to what it means to be a civilization. At the foundation of an urban civilization is a surplus of food. And that is something that is made possible by irrigation, which allows farming to become much more productive than it is on a non-irrigation model. The thing is you have to remember that historically, 80% or more of the society, any of these ancient societies up until quite recently, has to spend their time producing food. Which means that in any of the societies we're going to be talking about, the peasant farmers or the peasant herders are the vast majority of the society. They're the ones who are producing the food. And they're most of the people, because that's how many people it takes to just support the others who are not farmers or herders. The thing is, however, we are probably going to spend the least time talking about the peasants. We know the least about them because they were much more unlikely to have any kind of written records being left. Sometimes we can find about them from various sources like court records, maybe descriptions by people in the elite talking about peasants. But short of those methods, or short of archaeology investigating their villages, we really do know comparatively little about them, and yet they're the foundation on which these societies survive. What the peasants support are a number of elites, and the status of those elites vary, and the breakdown of them varies as well, depending on the situation. Usually there's a caste or a group of artisans or craftsmen, people who make specialized goods with their hands usually. So this would be the carvers, possibly, depending on the society, weavers, skilled craftsmen who make art pieces, offerings, who make the luxuries of a king or noble household, furniture, things like that. So the skilled makers of things. Scribes are the people who write things down. And in most of the ancient societies, writing is a very complex task. You have to learn a huge number of symbols, most of which are associated directly with a single word, in order to be able to effectively write. And so writing is a task for specialists, and scribes are the specialists who do the writing. Priests, people who lead religious worship. Warriors, the people who fight, the men whose loyalty and support is critical for both the nobles and the kings to maintain their power and status. Nobles, the members of the elite, close to the top of society, but not at the very top. And then, of course, kings or emperors or pharaohs, depending on the society. The leader at the top of the society, the person who controls the government. All of those groups have to be supported by peasant farmers. Cities. The way cities operate is that you would have a surrounding area that belonged to the city that was used for rural farming, possibly herding. That's the vast majority of the people in the area. In the city itself, that's where the elites would live, usually. And it's sort of the opposite of how we think of cities being arranged today. Today, we tend to think of the more luxurious type of living on the outskirts and the suburbs, whereas the poor neighborhoods are in the center of the city, the inner city. Pretty much the exact opposite if you're thinking about ancient cities. The most important buildings, the palaces, the monuments, the temples, those are generally built at the center of the city. And then the more you get out, the poorer the neighborhoods get. And at the very outskirts of the city, that's where they would have the industries that were the most polluting and most offensive, basically. So things like leather tanning, which one of the constituents using for tanning leather would be urine. Similar kinds of things that you probably don't want to be smelling or hearing or being around. And those would all be on the outskirts. So moving in, you're moving into the higher areas of society, the more elite areas of society. The cities themselves are centers of government and they're centers of religion. So you may have participated in religious worship in a rural shrine, but in a lot of these societies we're going to be talking about, any kind of a major religious festival often we'll be focusing in the temples in the cities. And of course, that's where the kings are. That's where the tax collectors bring their wealth. The cities are the place where it takes place. Once again, these often were focused in the cities themselves, and the building of them and the creation of them usually depended on the availability of peasant workers. And that would not be an uncommon form of taxation, that you actually owe a certain amount of work every year to the record keeping is one of the things that helps civilization to focus. You have to have records of who's paid what for taxes, what kind of trade agreements have been made, what kinds of things you brought in trade, basically account books, record keeping. And in fact, some of the earliest writing seems to have been writing that was developed for keeping track of financial transactions. So-and-so paid so much in rent last year. So-and-so paid too little in rent this last year. So-and-so paid a surplus in rent the last year, or taxes. So these various commercial transactions, governmental transactions, are really what tends to stimulate, they think, one of the earlier uses of written language. In these cases, they're going to develop out of these desires to keep these records, which in some cases formed as a very often they develop writing to help keep these records, but it doesn't have to be in a written language. In the case of the Incas, for example, in what is now Peru, their government kept what are called cupus. If you look at the case of the Incas in what is nowadays Peru and the Andes Mountains, they did not have a written language system, a system of writing, but they kept records by using a system of knotted ropes that allowed them to keep that same kind of taxation records, financial transaction records that other societies keep using written language. And then, of course, as we just already talked about a little bit earlier, the scribes themselves, who are the writing specialists, but also, because of their ability to write and keep records, become administrators at various different levels. Most ancient societies had a concept of spirituality where the forces of the natural world were tied to various spirits and gods. And in order to manipulate those forces of nature, change them, get them to do what you needed them to do, the important things like letting the rivers flood in the spring so you would have fresh soil to plant, making sure that you got the rainfall you needed to water the crops, making sure that all the other natural forces that you depended upon in farming and in other aspects of life would be amenable to humans. They depended on having religious specialists, usually priests, whose job was to appease the spirits and gods through rituals and offerings. And the exact pattern that would take varied from society to society. But the basic concept is there that the job of the priests is to appease the gods, please the gods and spirits, so that they will look after the city, look after the community. And because of that, religion is usually seen as very closely tied to the government, because what they are doing by trying to work with and appease the gods are doing the things that it's going to make it possible for the city to exist and succeed. And so trying to make sure that actually happens is a critically important aspect of society, so important that it has to be dealt with the support of the king, with the support of government. One other thing about that is that divination also usually plays a significant role. Once again, very different patterns in different societies. In the case of Mesopotamia, there was a huge emphasis on watching and observing the stars and predicting from that astronomical knowledge. They hoped that that would give them understanding of what was coming ahead. I know that we would tend to differentiate between astrology, predictions of the future, astronomy as the actual study of the stars. For Mesopotamians, they did them both at the same time, seriously studied the stars, thinking that would help them to interpret or predict the future. Other societies did it in different ways. We'll be talking about the Shang a little later, who did it through, basically through ritual tortoise shells, but we'll talk about that later. But there's always this attempt to appease the spirits, appease the gods, but also to try to predict what's going to happen next. And what they're trying to predict can be anything from the next harvest to the coming crises in the royal family of succession. Ordinary people, and even people in the elite, usually depended on kinship networks. So you might well live with your immediate family, your father, your mother, your siblings. But frequently that family would exist within a kinship network, and that kinship network would extend far beyond just your immediate family or even your grandparents or great-grandparents. In fact, the kinship network is supposed to link families together across different villages or across the city, and they act as sort of a mutual network for support for the people who belong to it, the families that belong into it. Not uncommonly, those kinship networks, those family lineages is a frequent term for it, would claim to have a common ancestor, often as what we would consider a mythical figure as a common ancestor. Kinship networks, by the way, doesn't just include the living, they also include the spirits of the ancestors who went before you. And in a sense, because of the obligation you have usually to provide a next generation, you could also say, in a sense, it also links forward into the future of the children who are coming next. But because of the importance of the spirits of the ancestors, most of these societies will have things like yearly rituals in which it's expected to leave food out for the spirits of the dead, depending on society deciding the details. But still, that sense that they're there, they need to be looked after, they need to receive offerings. In addition to the kinship networks, there's also a sense of citizenship, belonging to a specific territory and the government of that territory. And in fact, that could be intensely, I guess you could say, patriotic for the individuals involved. My city is better than your city. My land is better than your land. So it's not just a question of belonging to a kinship network, which is an older concept, but also this new concept of having political citizenship in a government and territory. At the base of it, all of this depends on the peasants. Without them producing that food surplus, none of this would be possible. An Egyptian poet describes the farmer's life this way. The farmer, he complains incessantly, his cry more raucous than the ravens. His fingers go about their duties through all the ragings of the storm. Wearied beyond reward, down in the marshes, he becomes a living wreck. His storehouse is depleted by the lions. He reaches home exhausted, and then the taxman cuts him down. Maybe that's overly bleak, but in effect, the peasants may have been the bottom of society, but they were also the foundation of society and what made these civilizations possible.